Happy October 1st. It's my pleasure to be hosting our first Global Avenues Ed of the year. My name is Jeff Clark. I'm president of Avenues, the World School, and we're excited to be with everyone today from New York, Sao Paulo, from our online community, from Shenzhen and Silicon Valley, and excited to have a conversation today about the power of community. Before we get into our discussion, I just wanted to let our audience know a couple things. First, there is an option for simultaneous translation into Portuguese today. So at the bottom of your screen, you can select a language and we will have translation available today and in Portuguese. And the second thing is if anybody has questions, there's a Q&A button, and it'll go to our team and they'll pass along your questions as we get into our discussion, and happy to address those. We want this to be as much of a dialogue as possible in this setting. Part of the reason to talk about community is to hopefully further our community across the globe. So I'm excited to be joined by three panelists today. First, Natalie Emerson. She's our current president of the Avenues Parent Association in New York. And we're excited for her to join us. The Avenues Parent Association has just begun in Sao Paulo. And I know she and some others were able to spend some time with the board there, as was I, and we are getting ready to start some parent association activities in Shenzhen and online as well. Our second, so Natalie, maybe you and I can just start with a conversation, and then I'll introduce Catalina and Dr. Mike Johannick as well as we get in the conversation. So Natalie, when we talk about community, you decided to join the Avenues community. What was something that attracted you to Avenues, and something maybe that you're excited about in the role of Avenues Parent Association to further our community?
Oh, it's tough to answer that in a short manner. There's a lot that attracted us to Avenues. You know, my husband and I, we've been at Avenues now for 7 years. When our oldest daughter was joining nursery, so the Threes program. And I think at that point we had realized that the world was changing rapidly, that jobs and industries were coming and going, they were having to adapt. We wanted to send our children to a program that had an emphasis on collaborative working and collaborative learning. We saw that more so as a future. And personally, our kids are made of a background from 4 different continents. We're a pretty multicultural family. So we wanted our children to be exposed to other children who were not all the same, and that went to school in an environment where differences were celebrated and valued. We really felt strongly that as they grew and as they became young adults, we didn't want them to be only known in kind of this New York City microcosm bubble that sometimes happens in New York, and Avenues was really attractive to us for that. The big emphasis on technology and engineering, and the thought of problem solving, how one gets to the answer, not just knowing the correct answer, to us, that was also strongly appealing. And without question, it was appealing to do the bilingual education and have campuses around the world. So sorry, that wasn't a short answer, but there's a lot of reasons why Avenues appealed to us, and it was kind of a no-brainer. We just fell in love from the beginning.
Yeah, that's great. So next panelist is Catalina Guzman. She is our Director of Student Wellbeing in Avenues Sao Paulo, and we were very excited when she joined us from where when she moved back to Sao Paulo after having studied in Sao Paulo in some of her earlier career as a student. But she's been all around the world, from Johannesburg and Taipei and Saudi Arabia, and working at the admissions offices at Penn. And we're excited to have you with us. Catalina, maybe same question to you. When you think about community and the Avenues community, what attracted you to to Avenues?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing that attracted me about Avenues was the fact that it wasn't afraid to try new things. I talk a lot to, I work very closely with the deans, which means I work very closely with students. And one of the things that I'm always talking about is that need that students should have to develop their own personal pathways and definitions of what success means. And I think Avenues is uniquely positioned to allow that to happen because we are not subject to a specific sort of external curriculum. Our students really can make the most of their own education. They can carve out, there's these very unique and specialized pathways for whatever success is for them moving forward. And I think Avenues really emphasizes that idea when we talk about student well-being, when we talk about, you know, what is school meant to prepare you for? And school is meant to prepare you for life. It's meant to prepare you to be part of that much larger community that we call society. And so that was probably the biggest reason that I came to Avenues.
Great, thank you. And then our third panelist today is Dr. Mike Johanneck from University of Pennsylvania. And at Penn, he's in the Graduate School of Education. One of his research areas is school choice, school and education reform, and also done a lot of work as it relates to community and schools. He has the advantage of kind of knowing Avenues through a couple different folks who are students of his or have been students of his. So my first question is, who is your favorite student that you've ever had from Avenues? I'm just joking. No, that would be an unfair question because I'm sure they're all your favorites. So no, as we kind of get into the subject of community and schools, I'd be interested in any of your observations about how our schools possibly unique communities from some others, and some things that you've noticed that make bonds particularly strong within school communities.
Also a large question, but thank you very
Yes.
much for the, thank you. And kudos to your community for having such big questions and wrestling with them. So thank you for the invitation. It says a lot that you all decide to get together and tackle a huge question like this. I mean, I think, you know, I look forward to the conversation. I do have a strong interest in these because I think community, when we talk about community, we start to highlight trade-offs that sometimes need to be named in order for us to face. So we all want to, I noticed that part of your, in your materials, as I was trying to brush up a bit, was that you're interested in preparing people who have an ease beyond their borders, which I love that expression. Of course, it isn't interesting because we're at a time when a lot of commentators think that people don't feel a sense of their own communities or borders. And so how does one trade off those things in which you feel you're part of something that has a border, that has a community, and on the other hand, it supports you moving beyond that. So I think it's an interesting challenge. I think it's the communities that I've seen that are most successful in various criteria are deliberate in trying to figure out what the purpose of having a community is and for whom within that community. In an era in which, at least in the US and other contexts, we tend to be in pretty transactional relationships with each other. What is it that would be non-transactional about a community relationship? And I think that's, anyway, but I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we'll definitely get into a little bit about talking about relationships as well as shared identity. And I'll plant the seed. One of the things when I talked to some of my colleagues in China about the topic of community, as I was thinking about a phrase that came up often was benevolence, which I think is interesting concept for us to kind of weave in for some of our discussion. I appreciate you referencing part of our mission. Another part of our mission statement says that we're aware that our behaviors make a difference in the ecosystem that we're in. And that is currently very acute right now. So I'm just wondering, from your maybe different perspectives, Natalie, as a parent, and Kata as a leader within our community and part of our team, and Mike, your view from outside of Avenues. What are some of the real challenges that you're seeing with communities right now, and particularly thinking about how our behaviors affect the ecosystem overall, both inside Avenues and outside Avenues?
You know, it's interesting because I think there are two parts to that answer, and it depends if we're talking about living in our COVID world right now or not living in our COVID world, pre-COVID, what our normal used to be. I could say pre-COVID, I think a lot of our New York City campus community is really driven on doing good. What does that mean? It's doing good within our building, but also doing good outside of our building. And I think it's been the cornerstone of what's made our community so strong in our New York City campus. You spoke of benevolence, and at the end of the day, I think each year we've been striving to be a kinder community, a more empathetic community, a more involved community. And I think with doing good to one another, to families that are going through hardships, to being good to our faculty and staff, being good to students who are going through things, that's definitely a way that I think our community has really gotten strong. But I think also working directly with our outside community, i.e. the community right across the street from us, right outside our doors. You know, when Avenues first started in New York City, it was built obviously in West Chelsea, which kind of has the largest spread socioeconomically that any New York City neighborhood has. You have a lot of the have-nots, and you have those that have less. There was a really big juxtaposition between one building on one side of the street and the other on the other. I think what we've done as a parent association, and the school has partaken in as well, and we've been really successful with, is that we've genuinely partnered with our neighbors, with Holy Apostle Soup Kitchen. When COVID happened, the school gave all the food that had been purchased for the students when we closed down, and sent it over to the Soup Kitchen and continued to supply them meals. The Parent Association raised, I think, $20,000 for the Soup Kitchen. It's the busiest soup kitchen in all of New York City. We have partners like St. Clement's and Chelsea Housing. And I think as well as doing good, we don't just do for the sake of doing, we partake very particularly in the fact that we get involved. We're not just giving to give. The students get involved, the parents get involved, the faculty gets involved. And I think it's been one of the major reasons why we are such a strong community at our New York City campus. It's based on doing good, both within and out.
Kata or Mike, would you guys add anything?
Sure. Sorry, I was just kind of taking notes and trying to organize my thoughts, but I think too, one of the things that we see a lot when we talk about community is, especially now when we're kind of forced to redefine what community is really thinking about some of the cultural contexts of how we even think about what is a community, right? I've lived, as you said, Jeff, I lived in 9 different countries around the world. I grew up as an expat. I'm what's known as a third culture kid, which means that my life was kind of always between cultures, both my parents' culture and the culture that I was in, and my school culture. So I sound very American when I speak in English. I sound very Colombian when I speak in Spanish. And I'm just kind of all over the place. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in my conversations with students and in my conversations with parents is this changing dynamic of what we talk about when we mean, or when we say community, right? For sort of the Latino diaspora, we tend to think of community as something where we are physically together, and we have, as a school and as a society, and I say this as somebody who spent 4 months in Colombia with her parents, it's been really hard for us to sort of readjust how we can still support each other, how we are still very much part and members of our communities. It's just that how those roles are playing out is slightly different. I think also one of the things that I'm seeing in terms of communities is this has played out so long that in some ways we are becoming negative feedbacks for ourselves. And so we tend to rely on communities, on our personal communities, to vent, to share our frustrations, when instead I would encourage our students and our families, and really all of us, to also use our communities to focus on the positive things. Yes, there's a lot of bad things that are happening in the world, but there's actually a lot of good that's coming out, right? I think Natalie's story about what they did with the soup kitchen. For us in Avenue São Paulo, we did our Cestas Básicas with Jardim Panorama, which is the community that we also have across the street. And so I do think that there are opportunities for communities to build us up, even in the sort of new and different dynamic of what we think of as community.
And it's interesting to think of the overlap of communities as opposed to their own bubbles or closed. So I think one of the things that I'm very excited about for this year for Avenues is how do we draw our community larger globally. So now that we have Sao Paulo, New York, Shenzhen online, and more families spread about, how do we stay connected? But then how do we go outside of our virtual or physical four walls that we're in order to invite others in and to make sure that we're creating a sense of belonging. Mike, your perspective on this from somebody outside of Avenues?
Well, so I just love hearing about the multiple campuses and the global and everything else. Having fallen in love with a Chilean some years ago and having a bilingual, bicultural home, it's a little piece of Santiago here in New York. I think that there's for me, part of the challenge, it seems, is in a number of efforts that have tried to do this kind of balance. Penn has a slogan about sort of being, active both locally and globally. I think that trade-off between which and who has what privilege to be where, the ability to not be local is quite a substantial privilege, and therefore the nature of them. Wonderful to hear about these kinds of partnerships, and the question that arises, I'm sure, and is already in the conversations, I suspect, is what is the nature of that over time? And I remember working partnerships with in other positions I've had across time, where people want to know, well, when it hits the fan, will you be here? At what level? And is the commitment, and I think this comes to a question of purpose. The addressing current and urgent needs, phenomenal. Trying to figure out why there's that across the street. And what is it that we understand? That problem solving that you talked about earlier, for instance, talk about a complex and enduring and rooted, embedded, complicated situation. How do we, and are we actually working that as part of our curriculum, if you will? Anyway, I just think those are fascinating questions because of the fact that some of us do have a lot more facility to be in other places and to not be as necessarily tied there to a local place. Because for many, that is where they will be. In some ways that can be terribly rewarding and wonderful in terms of the assets of that community. But it does put a trade-off between who is able to be local and who is able to be non-local, I guess. I don't know. That helps.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we didn't rehearse anything, but you teed up my next question perfectly that I wanted to ask you. And as somebody who studied education reform and school choice, I am guessing that something that has come up over time is the idea of shared purpose and shared values as being an important part of a strong school community. So there were a number of things that I've identified as things that can create a powerful community, but I'm wondering if from anything that you've seen from your study and research as it relates to common values, shared purpose, that you might offer to our community to be particularly mindful if we want to be strong and powerful.
So the strong and the powerful is always a question of toward what, it seems to be, or how would one know that?
Let's say healthy.
Healthy, right. Every organization has we all have the Maslowian levels. And some is enrollment and finances, and some of it is then higher levels that we're trying to see. I do think, on the choice element, one of the things that has been understandable but somewhat distracting is that the discussion around school choice has often been around governance options and whether or not an organization is private or public. and less attention to what I would love to hear more conversation about, and that is the public or private, the mix of public and private purposes that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable for. So we tend to have systems that hold ourselves accountable for the private outcomes within education. Did my kid learn something? Are they going to the school I want them to go to, et cetera, all those sorts of things, rather than, let's say, I don't know, are we creating a better level of civic discourse as a result of our participation in preparing the citizenry of this country? Who's gauging that? You know, one of my, you know, superintendents, if you have 50% of your students who don't pass a standardized ELA assessment, you're probably not staying on as superintendent or head of school, right? But if half of your students don't vote, no one's ever been fired, right? That was a public purpose of why we can use, I know there's a private institution, but people could use or get tax benefits even for being an institution that supports the compulsory levels of education for, in the US at least, in the Democratic Republic, in terms of what the goals are for that public. And I think that is, it seems to me that localities can therefore come to an agreement, pretend places have in the past. Some of my earlier research looking at places like East Harlem in the 30s and 40s, where you could establish a set of public purposes across privately managed, publicly managed, hybrid kinds of institutions. I do a lot of work with La Católica in Santiago, Chile. And for interesting historical reasons, they are technically a public institution because they were founded as a private institution when the state and the church were still together. So they are technically public, but they describe themselves as a public institution privately managed. And that actually was a reference that was used in the early 19th century in the US for a lot of schools and academies. Because they were putting forward, and I think the question then is, how would we hold ourselves accountable for the public purposes? You know, sort of like I don't know, in the corporate world, it's the social benefit corp kind of notion, right? How do we put on our public ledger what it is that we say we're going to move by way of a public purpose, and the potential of that being shared by others in our, however defined community.
Yeah, some of the language we talk about that we try to examine early on at Avenues is, why do we exist? Why does New York City or Sao Paulo or Shenzhen or any of the locales that we've talked about need another school at this moment of our kind? And some of what we landed on was, we exist to develop future world-wise leaders who are uniquely equipped to understand and solve global scale problems. And we certainly did not predict a near-term pandemic in that time. But when you think about global scale problems and needing world wisdom and understanding connectivity, understanding exponential growth, understanding that your individual actions may be low risk to you, but may be high risk to others, there's just a lot of complexity there that we hope our students will emerge as the leaders who are equipped to understand those and other big, gnarly problems that not only impact our generation, but many generations in the future. So we want our students to be good ancestors and change makers and trailblazers. And I think that's one of the things that holds some of our community together. Natalie, if I can ask you a quick question on APA. So you've been involved for a number of years. And one of the things that's different about an Avenues Parent Association than many parent associations is kind of what the purpose is. And community is right at the core. And when I was looking at some of the things that were listed as like, these are ways that you can accelerate or empower or have a healthy community, there were three that kind of stood out that seemed to have pretty good connection to APA purpose. So they were intentional connectivity, you know, having time to come together. Of course, some of that is more virtual than it is physical at the moment. Second was rituals, having some things that you do over time. And a third was shared experiences. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit with everybody. We have some people are brand new to Avenues, and talk a little bit about the role that you see APA playing, not only in New York, but across the globe for building community and welcoming people, particularly people who are new coming in and building those relationships quickly through connectivity.
Yeah, so our goal at in the APA at at Avenues. I'm on?
You are.
Sorry,
You're
something
good.
popped up. Thank you. Our goal is really to foster meaningful relationships amongst our families and between faculty and staff. We're really that bridge that kind of partners everyone together. And the ultimate goal is community with what we do. And what does that look like over the years since Avenue started? Is we've basically kind of become a really well-run organization that focuses on different affinities and interests of our parents and our children. We work with the school to accomplish lots of different things. You're talking about traditions. It was the Parent Association that finally started our first homecoming last year. And a lot of the traditions that we've been having are mainly led by the Parent Association. And we seek to continue to do that this year, even though we're kind of put up with this wall of not being able to meet one another face to face, but it's something we're not going to give up on. When you're talking about community at Avenues, it's really hard to describe, but there is something really intangible there. There's like an essence, and I know it sounds like I drank the Kool-Aid, but there just really is this feeling of we're all in this together, and we're all in it to help one another and to kind of help each other's children. And it's really unspoken, but it's present. And I think the hardest part this year is for our new families that came in this year that haven't been exposed to kind of who we are and that don't know other families and don't know other parents. I mean, the saving grace is that the kids are going to get to know each other wonderfully at school and through their teachers. But how do the parents feel like they're part of something when they can't physically walk in the door and when we're not physically allowed to meet together in groups? So we've been kind of thinking of a lot of things. You know, when school shut down in March, we did a ton of gaming and we did a ton of lecture series to have all of our families feel connected and stay connected and be able to talk to one another and kind of talk about their experience of what they were going through. But now we're trying to understand how do we have new families get to know one another, and something simple as a book club. We started a book club now for the first time. You know, with Zoom, when you're looking at 100 faces, it's kind of impossible to just have that conversation with the person to your right or your person to your left that you would have that takes place naturally when you're in large group conversations. And we thought, what better way to really get to know somebody than to share an experience of reading a beautiful story and finding someone's viewpoint about it and seeing that it's similar to yours or it's different from yours and learning from why someone else thinks a certain way. And we're starting a book club. But we're kind of just, as far as even traditions, you know, Halloween parade is one of the most exciting days at school for the kids, and we can't do a Halloween parade. For those of you that don't know, the kids get to wear costumes to school. It's probably their favorite day of the school year. It's a big deal for them. And they walk out the campus and they walk around the block and it's this big parade and people clap and, you know, it's exciting for them. So obviously we can't do that this year. And so we thought, well, let's have every parent in the grade send a picture of that child dressed up in their costume. And at lunch on Friday of Halloween, we'll put together a video montage of the grade so that they could see their friends in the other classrooms that they don't get to see and show off their costumes. And we're going to have a virtual parade. So it's really, you know, our goal is to keep traditions, to make new traditions, but essentially to keep us connected. You know, for an APA each year, we set out our own missions outside of the norms of what we're meant to do and what our goals are. And for me this year, I chose connectivity across our campuses. We have so many New York families that are now in different campuses, a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because as we said, we need to celebrate all our cultures, all our backgrounds. We need to understand everyone's experiences and be mindful of them and how they might differ from someone else's. And the other is faculty and staff appreciation. I think, you know, during this pandemic, we've learned a lot about what it is to teach a child. I think a lot of parents' eyes were like completely opened, how difficult it is to teach. But also to be mindful that we're all partners in this together. It really does take a village. It takes the parents, it takes the kids, it takes the faculty and staff, it takes the crossing guards, it takes the security guards. It takes literally every everybody within this community for this to work so that our children can get the maximum benefit from this experience and be well-rounded children when they graduate. And we as a parent body feel so thankful to these teachers and faculty and staff who also go home and have to teach their kids at home and are dealing with the stressors of life that we're all dealing with as a whole, and being mindful of that. So that's kind of where we are this year.
That's great. Thanks, Natalie. Catalina, the component of strong community that I wanted to ask you about is trust. You're someone who works directly with students often. You work with deans and other faculty members. You interface directly with families. You have a particular challenge that you're working through right now, that in a remote world, we are having our first graduating class from Sao Paulo. Our 12th graders there are thinking about next steps for them. There's a lot of trust of you and your team back and forth, and just wondering some thoughts that you have on trust within our community and things that we can do to make it stronger.
Absolutely. Trust is something that is built over time, and we are still relatively new. As you said, this is our first graduating class, so it's not like we have years and years of, this is where students went in the past, or this is what we've always done, because always is 2 years, which is not a very long always. So I think the first thing that we work on a lot when we talk about trust is a sense of shared responsibility and shared accountability, right? I think to Natalie's point where she was talking about, right, it takes a village, it's all of us in this together. In order for us to develop trust needs to go both ways, or 3 ways, or 4 ways, or 10 ways, depending on who's involved. And I think that sense of accountability, that sense of shared responsibility really helps us build trust, which helps us strengthen our community. So it starts in students and parents kind of getting involved and including the various different stakeholders that make up our communities. It isn't just the dean. It isn't just me as director of student well-being. It isn't just the head of school. It's our teachers. It's the staff members. It's, the secretary that's trying to help organize iPad deliveries, right? It's understanding that we are all, at the end of the day, we all share the same goal, which is we want to see Avenue students succeed. As I said before, what success looks like, we kind of leave open to interpretation depending on where the student is or what they want to define success as. But at the end of the day, that's why we all chose to work at Avenues, right? That's why we got involved, is because we want to see these children succeed. And so I think that shared sense of a common goal helps us build trust, right? And always assuming positive intent, even in this darkest and difficult time that we are currently facing. It's really important for all of us, regardless of what side of the conversation you're on, to assume positive intent, right? To know that there is somebody on the other side who is doing their best to help you, to find that information for you. If it's a parent, right? It's a parent that is doing their best to try to get their 17-year-old to wake up on time and show up to class, and right, like, we're all doing our best, and what our best looks like is not the same every day, and that's okay. But I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that this is something that we do have that shared goal. We really do want all of our kids to do well. And that's, I think, one of the big things of building trust, is just making sure that when we're talking about responsibility and accountability, that it comes from a place where we are assuming positive intent, and that really is our shared goal as a community. And I think that's what eventually brings us together, is knowing that we do share in that one really big goal.
Yeah, and you participated as one of our campus leaders. Every month we get together with all of our campus leaders around the globe to try to create some community amongst those leadership teams, but also to try to learn and challenge with each other. And the topic that we spent quite a bit of time on this past month was social contracting. the idea of trying to put ourselves in each other's shoes, in each other's position, and acting in a way that regardless of what seat we're sitting in, we would be understanding of decisions that are made or things like that. So, you know, there's some important questions that are really asked when you enter to kind of a more social contract type of relationship. It's how would you want to be treated? How do you think that person wants to be treated? How does the group want to be treated? And how do you resolve conflict? So regardless if you're in a community of 2 or 3,000, you're going to have conflicts. And so it's figuring out how, when there are disagreements, how you enter into discussions around those, and that it's appropriate for all parties involved. So something we're thinking about and trying to learn about, particularly at this moment that is higher stress and different for everybody. One of the things that we've quickly identified is nobody is an expert in the world at operating a school during a pandemic. So we're all doing more novel type of things. And so trying to figure out how to make the best decisions that we can, learning as fast as we can along the way. Well, each of you shared some on your backgrounds that a global perspective is something that is shared, and shared experiences, even if it's not identical. I'm curious, as you think about Avenue's goal to not only have local campus communities, but global school community, what are some things based on your experiences that you think could foster that the fastest? Mike, any ideas from you?
I mean, you know, I think the sort of setting up the usual mechanisms around alum engagement and activities and all those sorts of things makes all sorts of good sense. And I presume that part of the community, as you graduate out folks, and you have a few graduating groups out of New York already, that they begin to connect. And the question for them, I mean, I think the question for the organization is, what role do you imagine them to have? And you know, schools over time have always had a sort of conflicted relationship about alumni. You really like alumni for certain things, for getting together and for support. On the other hand, not necessarily in helping you decide on the biology curriculum. So, you know, you sort of have those kinds of mixes. I also tend to think that the best thing that links people of diverse backgrounds together is a goal that is recognizably transcendent. And that is outside of self-interest at some level. Yeah, you know, you think about what actually has motivated people over time to join into communities that are sustained and diverse. Very often it's in various religious traditions or other kinds of areas, or even in some nationalist traditions, not always for good ends, but at least there was a recognizable kind of a transcendent piece that people ascribe something to that gets them beyond just kith and kin and complete self-interest. And so you can get a little bit past that transactional. Talked a lot about the internal trust, and as a relatively new organization, that makes all the sense in the world. But you also asked the question about why exist in New York City. And you know, there's certainly, as you know, in New York City, all sorts of questions and experiences that many New Yorkers have had that would provide probably an initial disposition of distrust as to whose interests are served by a particular institution. And are there ways to make it part of the learning of that institution as to how one actually adds capacity to the resolution of what's going on locally? You know, there was a critique of progressive education, although progressive as a term is got a whole different meaning in these days, but progressive education 100+ years ago by George Counts, who went to a progressive education conference and gave a whole talk. And he basically said, if you are individually centered, student-centered, what you've done is sort of decided that the status quo is where you want to land. Because if it's individually student-centered, you don't have enough of a change of theory. Now, you should know that the conference he spoke at, they didn't give him any applause. It was just silent at the end. There were a lot of tired educators who said, really, going to throw that on our plate too? But I think this question of toward what, and can we model at least something that says we're going to establish a longer term relationship maybe with each of the localities involved or with some other entity and some other goal that over time we as a community will work to understand and try to do something about. That's not a transactional necessarily. I don't know. I mean, I think those kinds of goals that becomes a marker for individuals who participate in that experience, and they see the organization itself making that commitment, because we sometimes forget, I do, that many organizations are meant to be educational experiences by your life through them, in addition to the classes and everything else you might take, but that you sort of formed in the norms of it. And we have too many, Yuval Levin talks about the fact that too many of our organizations have just become platforms rather than experiences. So I become a person in Congress just to use that as a platform to get out my brand, as opposed to I'm actually adopting norms within it. So I think there's an opportunity for newer organizations to be deliberate about what those norms are that say we will be preparing ourselves to establish trust with those in the external world who have all sorts of reasons to doubt us and our commitment. And that, I think, is a huge skill for the world that we're in, because the differences and the economic differences and the racial injustice and so forth are globally a challenge. Anyway, talking too much, but that's.
Yeah, my guess is if it was measured kind of across the world, that trust of others that they don't have deep relationships with at the moment is probably near an all-time low. It's trusting information, trusting people who aren't like you, trusting people who are in different places than you, has certainly eroded some over this past year. And I think having intentional conversations within our community, across the families as adult to adult, and creating the places for our students to have that is fundamental for us. One of the first lessons learned is that you have to be willing to confront reality, and that is a reality of a lot of relationships today. Unless they were deeply rooted previously, there's more suspicion today and lower trust. And I think acknowledging that and figuring out ways that we can build that within our community and learn those tools, have our students learn those tools that they can apply later in life are going to be really important.
I would add that it's also important sometimes to be okay with having the awkward, uncomfortable conversation, right? And I think as our community gets bigger and it gets more diverse, there are going to be moments where somebody said something, quote unquote wrong, or that was interpreted because based on where I'm from or my beliefs or how I grew up, what you said made me feel blank. And so I think it is really important for us also to always be mindful that if we want to create a global community, then we need to make sure that all of our community members are comfortable and confident enough in themselves to learn from that uncomfortable conversation, to be able to admit, oh, wow, I'm so sorry, that wasn't my intent, and be able to grow from it, as opposed to suddenly, right, the walls go up and like, well, you misunderstood me, right? That's an automatic sort of conversation destroyer, as opposed to, wow, I didn't understand that, help me understand how I don't make the same mistake again. And I think if we are talking about that larger sense of trust, and to Michael's point, right, about like, how do we build a norm where we really want to position our alumni as these sort of global change makers, so to speak, I think we really need to get them comfortable with being uncomfortable, with being put in these positions where they are having to question what they thought in the past, because now they are being confronted by somebody who is just as educated as they are, because they go to the same school just in another country, who might be coming at this from a completely different angle. So I think part of how we do that is really helping our students engage in some of that really difficult and uncomfortable dialogue, and being able to really work through some of that discomfort to actually grow from it.
Jeff, I'm excited about the seed bank program that we're already doing.
Yes.
To me, this is kind of speaks to what your question was. How do we connect all these students from all these different campuses across the globe? And I think we're already doing it with that. And what it does is you're asking these students to work together to find problems in the world and to seek to find solutions. I think there were 40 of them that got together on a Zoom, what was it, a week ago?
Yes.
From our online campus, from Shenzhen, from every single one of our campuses, and are working together. But what's also fascinating about the program is we're enlisting parents from different fields, from different industries, to work as mentors to these students based on what they're trying to pursue. And also the alumni are being asked as well if they could partake in this. And I think this is this full coming circle and continuing to be a part of the community and to help the students in the community rise up to become adults, but then to eventually kind of recircle back to that community, but on a global scale. So I think this is already kind of starting that way with Seed Bank, but I think there are many more ways we can continue to do it.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, Seed Bank is something this is our third year of operating it. It's really an internal social venture fund, if you will. So what we saw is that we had students in a number of classes were coming up with great social entrepreneurship ideas. But as the saying goes by one of the more famous venture capitalists in the world, is that ideas are easy, execution is everything. And so what we wanted to do was to provide mentorship, provide funding in order for students to go put their ideas into action, and to instead of just come up with a plan, to implement it. And so this will be our third year. As Natalie said, they're student initiated projects. We want students to be coming up and learning and doing that within a space that has resources for them, from time, expertise, financial. We think that some can have great impact, as well as it's amazing learning for the students that are doing it just in a different way. My long-term goal for Seed Bank is that the entire apparatus of Seed Bank will be student-run, that they'll be administering everything except for kind of final investment decisions. But that's the goal.
That idea just generated in my mind, Jeff, if I may, the notion of I'm going back to I love the question about sort of the existential question at the beginning of why do we exist as an entity. And if part of it is these problem solving students and sort of providing them incentives and means to sort of experiment, play with that and understand that process of developing, sounds fantastic. I'm wondering, as something that, as you look at the relationship with local communities, for instance, or with cities and are there ways in which to be thinking about the school entity and the network? And you never want somebody guest on a panel coming up with ideas like this, by the way. This is always the thing. You want to turn their mic off right about now. But it's a question of whether or not...
We promote this at Avenues.
Good.
Part of our ethos is to never leave well enough alone. So go ahead.
Well, this idea that an institution, I think one of the things that is a long tradition in schooling in different countries. I know most in the US. It's a minor tradition, but I think it's a powerful one. And that is where the school itself becomes a utility for the community in trying to figure things out. So early on, I did some work on the school I mentioned in East Harlem. And part of what they did was to say, all right, it's part of your science class. You're going to research why we have the disease rates that we do in East Harlem, which are 3 to 4 times the city average. And so that was part of the science curriculum, was to solve that issue, working with East Harlem health agencies and so forth. And it would be interesting, I think, if the school itself positions itself in some portion. You'd have to figure out how you do that in the wider portfolio and everything else, mostly in student work. But would that be a place where others could do that, where the wider community outside of the school students, could an alum come back and test out an idea? And so, in other words, I think it has a utility in this space of institutions that I might have a relationship with over time that is different than I'm going to get my degree and move on to my next stage, which is what most schools do in terms of relationship. And you try to hang on with some good memories to keep. I'm going to one of my high school activities next week are online, so I understand the pull of that. And that's all very nice. But beyond that, I don't have to, I'm not going to them as a utility to try to affect something in the world. And I'm wondering whether or not that extends the idea of seed bank. I don't.
Yeah, that's really that really is at the essence of it, is we want students to identify problems. So I think the one nuance that would be different than what you described is as opposed to an adult really identifying the issue, we're creating space for students to identify issues and then helping them to figure out how to go and have an impact. So oftentimes that does manifest itself in a local action, but sometimes one of the earlier projects that we supported is a student had identified that tutoring within rural China was a real need, that there was a need for students to get extra support, and they created a platform to help work with how we could help students that were underschooled or under-resourced to have more access to help in tutoring when they needed it, and trying to use technology for that. So there's a number of things that will come out of this. One of the things that's been a little bit joyful during this time is, with our alumni that you mentioned, is we started a studio program in the Hamptons for students that are there, but we actually have 3 alumni who are working as part of that program, working with current students. So they've come back in different mentor or teaching type of roles to work with students, particularly during this time. So that's been fun to see. So as I mentioned, we're happy to take questions from others that are out there if you want to pitch in and have questions. Otherwise, we'll continue our dialogue. But if there are needs within the community to wanting to contribute to the questions to this, happy to take some of those if you send them through the Q&A, and we'll take our conversation in that direction. One of the questions that came up is thinking about, with Sao Paulo currently learning at distance, and then Avenues Online obviously is a complete at distance. We have over almost 2,000 students that are learning online at the moment. And even within our New York campus, a lot of the upper division students, they take some of their coursework online. And thinking of in this virtual environment, obviously we're doing this virtually tonight. What are some advice that our panelists might have for thinking about how we need to behave differently, or different norms that we need to develop, or different strategies that we need in a virtual environment versus a physical environment?
It's tough. It's tough. I think a lot of people have hit Zoom fatigue. And so if you are going to have this experience where you're having to use Zoom, it has to be worthwhile. And it has to have some type of connection. It can't just be for the sake of it to kind of fill the let's get together. I think there really has to be underlying meaning to it. It has to have people connect. It can't just be a bunch of people on the screen. So, for instance, last night we had 250 RSVPs for our first Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee meeting. Because there was a framework for what the meeting was going to be. There was a lot to share, a lot to talk about, and it was meaningful. So you had 250 parents participate in that. Well, there was a Zoom snafu, so not 250, but that was a Zoom issue. But they RSVP'd at least. And then it's how do you continue to still have these moments? And it's just, you really have to think out of the box. I mean, as an APA, we've asked all of our reps, whether they're committee reps or grade reps or division reps, is we have to kind of reinvent how we're all getting together, and it has to be out of the box. And but we're not doing things just for the sake of it. You know, in the spring, everyone was involved. You know, everyone's hair was growing really long. Men had like the most horrible, nobody cut their hair. We were all in lockdown. And we went to our parent body. One of our parents owns like a top-notch salon in New York City, Katia Solano. And we said, can you do us a favor? Can you Zoom and teach our entire parent body how to cut men's hair? And it was so well received, but I can't even tell you how much fun everyone had on it. So it's really just thinking out of the box and finding like what there genuinely is a need for, not to just, we've got to put a lot of programming out because it's the right thing to do. You have to figure out what people really need and how they need to be connected. And I think when you do that, it's much more well received and it's more meaningful. I mean, Dr. Glazer, our head of school, actually designed a Family Feud game. He made a Family Feud game based on avenues. And I can't tell you how nice it was throughout the entire summer that families stayed connected through it. So again, it's really thinking out of the box, but it has to fit a need. Otherwise it's not going to be useful.
And I think that's our experience as well. And I think it's also it's a lot more time on design than you do for anything you're doing in person, just by a multiple as to what you really need to do, what you could be doing in other ways, asynchronously and so forth. I think our experience has been a lot more time needed on just checking in with people. You can't get the same feel that you do when people walk in a room and you do all those sort of informal, how you doing kind of things on the way in. So there has to be a more intentional way of seeing where people are. I've also found some very interesting ways to leverage the fact that you can bring in anybody to help, and you can just ask them to come in for a half hour and pop in and pop out of a for conversations, as well as creative uses people have had of insisting on physical activity by people on the other end of the Zoom as part of integrated within the activity, particularly inspired by elementary school teachers who are trying to figure out how to do that as well. But even down to things like randomly sorting people every once in a while during sessions when you have 250 people who never meet each other, and to randomly have them, you know, there are ways in which they might actually then meet more people than they would have if they got there in person. But anyway, I'm sure everybody's got a zillion of those.
Random Zoom breakout rooms are a great thing. So
I think too, I mean, when we talk about kids know more about computers and ways to connect via computers than any of us do. So sometimes it's asking them, right? Like they might want to do a TikTok challenge or whatever new app is going to replace TikTok in the US, I'm not sure. But right, like whatever it is, I think sometimes it's also helping some of our students and our community members feel empowered to make some of those decisions in terms of how are we building community and how are we kind of reaching out to each other and what are the platforms that we can use. So right, I know, for example, for us at Avenues, there were several activities that were being run through Flipgrid, right? So it's still video, the kids still kind of get to interact, but it was done in a way that didn't necessarily put you on the spot within Zoom. So I think sometimes when we think about creating communities online, particularly for Avenues Online, sometimes reaching out to the kids themselves, they have some really cool, clever ideas that I personally would never have thought of. We had kids design an escape room online. They were in groups and it worked, like, and the kids had an incredible time. What were they escaping? Who knows? Because we're all like, they were able to pull it off. So I would say, you know, never underestimate what kids can come up with, because their command of technology and sort of an online platform far surpasses ours.
Kelly, I'm going to ask you this question as well that came in. The question is about, you know, there's lots of evidence that communities benefit from different cultures being part of it. And the question is, do you think that our students at Avenues already realize the privilege that they have to collaborate with global partners for some of the things? And this question further one is, what are some ways that Avenues is fostering this idea?
I think to an extent, yes. I think it's hard sometimes to recognize your privilege when you've grown up in privilege, right? So when it's not seen as something new, so it's easy sometimes to to assume that that is the norm, and therefore you don't necessarily always acknowledge just how privileged you are. But I think that those conversations are happening on our campuses, right? So the fact that on Sao Paulo's campus, for example, we had Black Awareness Week, and we've had several other types of conversations that really celebrate the diversity, the history, the cultural diaspora, if you will, of what we have just on our campus, and then also reaching out projects across campuses. So one of our fifth term projects last year was the Agora project, which was this publication basically that happened in conjunction, students from New York, students from Sao Paulo, and they were able to come together to create a publication. So I think our students are learning to take advantage of the cultural differences and the access that they have to that. But I think we still have a ways to go. I'm excited by the fact that we actually now have students who are proposing projects, right? So I'm one of the members of our sort of DEI team here in Sao Paulo, and we have students who are proposing projects. So I think that that's a really positive step. I know in New York as well, they've had students who are really kind of spearheading some of these initiatives. So I think we're headed in the right direction. I think we have a ways to go. I would say that that's true of any school around the world, right? The last school I worked at was the American International School of Johannesburg, arguably the most diverse school in the world. It has over 100 different countries represented in its student body every year. And they still had a ways to go, because depending on who's in your community or what the events were of the year, those conversations are going to change, and our understanding of why those conversations are important, or even why we're having those conversations in this moment, is going to change. So I think that's something that we can always do better, even when we're doing it well, and I think we are doing it well. It's something we can always do better and always do more of.
Yeah, an important component of our philosophy is to allow space and really an expectation that students will initiate and lead with inquiry, as opposed, and which really asks adults in our community to set aside some of our personal agendas in service to students and their agendas and their discovery. Probably if I was at the progressive education conference that you spoke of, I'm sure I would have asked some questions because I think I understand the point that if it's all about student inquiry, if it is just about crystallized intelligence, things that you can teach students, that's very different in my mind than creating space for students to start working on novel things or things that they haven't approached or can't just be directly taught, and a more fluid intelligence side. And so for us at Avenues, we recognize that there are schools, and we try to be one, make sure we're the one that can further crystallize intelligence, but not very many have had success on furthering fluid intelligence. And we want to be a place where students can grow in their ability of how to approach new novel problems that they've never seen before. And I think that inquiry, which would fall into the progressive realm, is critical in order to get there, because you really have to move through some of the stages of surface knowledge, deep knowledge, and then get into what would be transfer to a new domain, a new area, and to have enough confidence to ask a question that, of course, I don't know this, I haven't seen this before. What is it that I can do to discover this? I think that's a critical element.
Yeah, I think that makes a great deal of sense. I think part of what got folks annoyed at that conference with the speaker that you mentioned, and he was not nearly as articulate about fluid and crystallized intelligence as you just were, but it really was the claim about are there certain kinds of problems, if you will, or certain positions that the institution has relative to those. So if you find yourself in a situation where you have the following challenges that are persistent challenges of your wider community, is there a recognizable organizational stance of inquiry toward those that are called out? And I think that's a challenging thing for organizations, because you're trying to do a breadth. There's all sorts of, in our current context, all sorts of language that is immediately leveraged to polarize and so forth. But to say, I mean, you know, New York City is one of the most segregated one of the most segregated cities in the country, if not the. And so does that have anything to do with why the institute, is that an issue on which there is something to be addressed or not? It may not be, but I think the idea of how one chooses some public challenges, and I think you're absolutely right, the fluidity of the humility of knowing there's no way we have an answer to this right now. And the need for that kind of fluid intelligence to be really wrestling with it is critical. And are there certain value propositions that we will underpin some, you know, will we put our finger on the scale a little bit as to some of the challenges that we want to encourage wrestling with? It's just an organizational question, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's helpful. Natalie, a question from an audience member just around student relationships as part of a community. Here, I think maybe a parent perspective would be interesting, just how you might think about that of your kids developing strong ties to people who aren't part of their local environment.
They do. So, you know, our campus, and I'm trying to understand if you mean local as far as neighborhoods in New York City, as far as like a span of distance, or are you talking, I'm trying to understand what that means.
I'm reading the question. I would take it as
okay, you read it verbatim.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would think of it as like a neighborhood or country, or it's like how important to you as a parent, and what do you think about this might be for your daughters of having some strong ties that aren't just you're not rubbing shoulders with every day?
It's actually one of the things that I love the most about all of their friendships. I love that their friendships aren't just from this, you know, 10-block radius of our local neighborhood that we live in. Because with that comes just different ideas, different ways of living. They have friends from different New York City boroughs from Avenues. And I know that might sound not like a big deal, but, you know, for New York City dwellers, you tend to stay within your neighborhood because it's pragmatic and it's easy and you don't have to travel. But it's so nice that my children have friends from multiple boroughs around New York City. I think they get a lot of value from that. I think it's fantastic. I also just really like that a lot of their friends have really different backgrounds. I like that a lot of their friends' parents might, you know, English is most definitely not their first language sometimes. And I like that. You know, I'm a first generation American, and I remember as a kid, my father was the only one of all my, amongst all my friends' parents that had an accent. And I remember how alienating that felt and how strange that felt. I want them to be surrounded by differences. I think for them to grow up as really true citizens of the world, they have to be. And I think it's a disservice if they're not. So from a parent perspective, it's beautiful. It's one of the main reasons why Avenues is so right for our family.
Great. I had mentioned early on that when I talked to a couple of my colleagues in China about community, the concept of benevolence, being giving, came up more than once. Just as the three of you reflect on community overall, what kind of role do you think benevolence, and what did that spark in your mind when you heard that come across?
Not what actually struck me was almost the flip side of that, and that is I think one of the challenges I'll project for myself, often find myself within a community having is I'm almost more tending to, and I find it more that others, and maybe I just have had good luck, tend to be sort of benevolent to disposition. I find it often more challenging and yet more significant for building a community when I can accept somebody else's benevolence within that community, and sort of acknowledge that they're bringing something and I'm not, and different, and and valuable for what I would bring. If by benevolence we mean, though, as well, and perhaps to early parts of the conversation, a presumption about the goodness of others that are in that grouping, I think that is an important aspect. I've been reading an obscure, well, maybe for, and most people aren't going to recognize somebody, Joseph Pieper, who was a philosopher last century and such. And one of the things he tries to help rescue is the notion that intelligence and knowing in the Western world has traditionally had two components, the ratio element of it and the intellectus aspect of it. And we've sort of honed in on the ratio one, which is how you problem solve and do effort by yourself. The other is the how do you be present to what it is you can know. And I think in benevolence, as you said that, it speaks to that sense of how we know in a community when we make a deliberate choice to be present to what it is others are bringing to us. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but, or it could be the hour in the Zoom.
Yeah, no, I mean, part of the reason I wanted to ask some of my colleagues in China is, you know, often in terms of big concepts, you will see an influence of Western thought versus Eastern thought in how things are thought about and approached. And so, well, it's a holiday in China currently and very early in the morning, so it didn't work for very many of our families to be on at this time. I wanted to gather some input of our colleagues there because I find it so informative to look through things in a different lens. And it struck me as like, if you asked me the first 10 words that I would list off of community, benevolence might not be in the top 10. And I thought it was thought provoking. So I just wanted to get your reactions as well.
Well, I'll admit I looked up the definition of benevolence because even though I had a general sense of what it means, I wanted to know like exactly what the word means. And it says the quality of being well-meaning, right? And I spent time in Asia. I lived in China, and as you said, I lived in Taipei and Taiwan as well. And I will say that when we think about communities, that sense of, am I part of a group of people who are actually looking out for my best interest, whatever that best interest is that we have decided upon as a community. So to me, that word of benevolence makes a lot of sense when we're thinking about school communities, right? And it goes back to that sense of shared value, shared goal, shared ethos, right? If we're thinking about, again, the quality of being well-meaning, right? That assumption of positive intent, that assumption that we are in this together, that we are here to support each other, to grow together, to lean on each other when things are difficult, because we understand the importance of being kind, that we need those moments, right? As much as it can be, and I think to Michael's point, right? Sometimes it's easier to be kind to others than it is necessarily to receive that kindness. I think when we think about really strong communities, it is communities who are able to have that back and forth and who are willing not just to be the benevolent person, but to receive that benevolence. And it comes from this shared understanding that we're in it together because we have a common goal.
Yeah, I think kindness is the right sentiment. And I mean, even thinking about it in the list, it brings you a little joy to your community to think that it's intentionally kind to others.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to have a strong community, it honestly has to be a pillar of it, because with kindness, with giving does come trust, and when you trust that just by fault everyone does have good intentions, it can clearly bring you closer together. You know, not to look at the state of our country, but there's just so much mistrust, and it's why we're so divided, because unfortunately there's a lack of kindness across the board. And so kindness is kind of a backbone of what community is. I mean, if community doesn't have kindness, I'm not sure how it can function or how it can survive for the long term.
So the final question I wanted to ask tonight, you know, an important part of our curriculum, actually our first element within Avenues World Elements, is empathy. And when a lot of what we've talked about when it comes to strong community, the empathy needs to be front and center. So what are some lessons or thoughts that you would have on the role that empathy can be fostered within a growing, changing, evolving community?
First, I have to say, I love the fact that our number one element is empathy, right? I think that it sets us up in understanding that this is something that we really believe in. But the second thing that I think is really important is that sometimes people seem to think that we are either born with empathy or not. Empathy is a skill. Empathy is something that we have to learn and work on and continuously develop. And so I think as we think about creating communities, and if we really do want empathy to be a pillar of how we are designing the Avenues community, then we need to make sure that we are including activities and lessons and moments where our community is able to continue to develop and learn and grow those skills that make up empathy. Part of that is understanding of different cultures, understanding of different perspectives, but also a lot of empathy comes from within, right? So it's also your ability to forgive yourself, right? If you're in a position where you have a growth mindset and faltering or making mistakes as an opportunity for growth, and you're able to see that from an empathetic lens just in yourself, you're also more likely then to be able to kind of project that out. So I think that when we think about empathy as one of our guiding elements as a school, I think it's really important that we recognize that this is something that we aim to help our students continue to develop, to learn, just as we want them to learn all kinds of other skills. But empathy is something that we have to continuously work on. It's not something that people are kind of born with, or that you're naturally better than others. It really is something that you can develop and that we can share as a community.
Yeah, and as some may know, our R&D team worked to actually measure to see if we think we can grow empathy through certain learning experiences, and we've had some success with that. And it's critical if we're going to really have students become world wise and problem solvers. Without empathy, neither of those goals are likely to be achieved. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm influenced by a recent read of Marianne Wolf's work, who I think the latest book is Reader Come Home, and it is talking about the reading brain in this time period. And what struck me, knowing very little about neuroscience, unfortunately, was her sharing somebody who specializes in reading and neuroscience. Is Marianne Wolf out at, I think she's now at UCLA. But in terms of the ways in which parts of the brain that when you're reading a novel and doing a deep read in that way, that many of the parts of the brain in which you might actually do that physical activity begin to light up when you read about somebody else doing it. And so you actually get this development of empathetic capacity through the deep reading experience in ways that are very powerful. Now, her question is sort of in the digital reading world, where people's patterns of reading have shifted in the way they do that. How do you develop it with a balance approach? Because the digital reading is a very different kind of skill and gives you information processing skills that deep reading may not, but it may not give you the development of empathy. So I just wonder whether that's an area which I thought was compelling in terms of the state of the research, at least, that seems to suggest that a particular kind of engagement with reading is an important part of that development. I think the other has to do with this nature of how you, and I love the fact that it is one of your core elements on empathy. And I think the degree to which an organization communicates that there is a level of the relationship that is not merit-based. That can be tough because every organization wants to kind of have some boundaries on how they do that, and reasonably enough. But that again, I guess, comes to some of this transcendency of goals that people feel that there's something that the organization subscribes to that is larger, and that I have a relationship with this institution and with others here that goes beyond that. And I think what you all have been speaking of seems to indicate that in the kind of ways that you deal with each other and with the school and with your students and such. But we're in such a transactional, everyone getting likes on everything they do, that performance evaluated relationships are so central and have crowded out this notion that can I have a relationship with somebody that there's no rating involved here, and therefore create a space to learn something about them independent of that. But,
yeah, great. Natalie, any final words for the community?
It's hard to follow those two. No, I mean, I think it goes without saying that empathy really is a cornerstone of Avenues curriculum, and I hope Avenues as a community. I personally witness it on a daily basis, and so for me to talk about it, it's kind of just the norm. But there's always work to do, and there's work to do with teaching our children, our youngest and our oldest, to have an empathetic viewpoint. And to look at things through a different lens. But I think the goal is there, and I think we're working at it, and it gives me hope for the future.
Yeah, that's great. Hope is a good way to conclude tonight. So I appreciate the three of you spending your first day of October with us. I hope all that are viewing this live or viewing it recorded found some belonging as part of our community by participating tonight. And my broader hope is that we all decide to draw our circles a little bit larger to expand our community, both inside the walls of Avenues and outside the walls of Avenues. So I appreciate you joining us tonight, and look forward to our next opportunity discussion at Open Ed. So thank you, everybody. Good night.
thank you all.